We choose hope over fear. We choose unity over division, science over fiction. And yes, we choose truth over lies.
Those words, delivered by Joe Biden in the final days of the 2020 campaign, framed the election in sweeping terms. Truth itself was on the ballot. And that's where we left off last time. One might have hoped that Biden's decisive victory would have settled some basic disagreements. After all, elections have consequences, or at least they're supposed to.
Yet, as we all know, in the interregnum between the election and the inauguration, the nation's divisions erupted in violent insurrection. After uttering tens of thousands of falsehoods during his presidency, Trump saved his biggest, most destructive lie for last. In August 2020, months before the general election, Trump began laying the groundwork for the big lie when he claimed that the only way he would lose the election was if it was rigged.
The insurrection at the Capitol was the culmination of the big lie. This open and armed assault on truth by our own president and our own citizens takes us way, way beyond traditional partisan divisions. I mean, remember when we talked regularly about the culture wars? Those were about those hot button issues like abortion, gay marriage, and the death penalty. What has emerged in recent years is just so much different. What we're seeing now is not just a culture war, but a truth divide, marked by huge differences, not only over policy, but over the claims of reality itself. The assault on truth is at the same time an assault on democracy, too. We saw on January 6th how violent that assault has become.
And the assault on truth continued even after the attack on the Capitol, because only hours after the rioters dispersed, 147 Republican representatives and senators returned to their chambers and cast their votes for the big lie and to reject certifying the legitimacy of the election of Joe Biden to the presidency.
Denials about COVID, climate change science, the identity of the rioters who are storming the Capitol, the election results, even basic democratic norms and electoral practices have created an epistemological tear in the fabric of our nation, a crisis of what we know or can assume about the shared reality we inhabit. We take the view that truth is what unites us, that reality is binding on all of us, regardless of party, regardless of religion, or any other differences. And yet, as we begin 2021, it feels as though the truth is what divides us.
So how can we begin to close the chasm between truth and alternative truth, alternative facts, a chasm which is erupting into open violence in our country? How do we recover truth in a democracy under siege? I'm Tracy Fessenden.
And I'm John Carlson.
And this is Recovering Truth, a podcast from Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict in partnership with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. In this episode, we take up the truth divide that the violent events of January 6th brought so starkly into view. And we're joined today by two of our colleagues in the Recovering Truth Project. Postdoctoral fellow Sarah Ricardi-Swartz is a sociocultural anthropologist whose work examines the role of conservative Christian movements in the U.S. with a focus on American converts to Russian Orthodoxy. Recovering Truth journalism fellow Sarah Posner is the author of Unholy: Why White Evangelicals Worship at the Altar of Donald Trump, and she's a reporting fellow at Type Investigations. So we want to think about how we can begin to restore truth or close the truth divide in a democracy under siege. And we're particularly interested in hearing you both address that question from your respective fields of investigation as a journalist, Sarah Posner, and as an anthropologist, Sarah Ricardi-Swartz. Both your fields are devoted to the pursuit of truth. So Sarah Posner, journalist, why don't you start us off?
I think that one of Trump's very dubious achievements was breaking the media, because he knew that reporters have to report both sides, or they feel the compulsion to report both sides. And how do they do that when the President of the United States and his press secretary and other aides are using the bully pulpit of the most powerful person in the world to lie? And I think that reporters had a hard time dealing with that. And they had a hard time dealing with the reality that the president of the United States broke our politics. And so they felt compelled a lot of the time to just report it as if he was a highly unusual president, or maybe someone who was operating outside the norms of our politics, but we're not really sure how to describe that. And they confined themselves in the typical reporting of, this is what the Republican Party wants, or this is what the Democratic Party wants, and the two sides can't come together. And we don't know how that, you decide. And I think that journalism needs to have a reassessment of how it reports on a fascist leader, because now we have had a fascist leader. We're still ostensibly a democracy with a free press. And I think the free press has to evaluate, how do we handle a fascist because the heart of fascism is lying.
Can I just follow up to that question? So one of the challenges is that if you're trying to recover some shared set of common understandings, when the press does try to do that, there's a large contingent, particularly among Trump supporters, who are not going to tune in at all, that are just going to write it off. And they will then simply dismiss what these newly reformed or new rules of journalism are. And that doesn't get us any closer to some kind of shared common understanding, right?
It's true that Trump loyalists are immune to truth. There are people living in our country who will never believe that there wasn't widespread voter fraud, and they will never believe that Joe Biden legitimately won the presidency. But I still think that, obviously, the press has to report on those truths and realities, but I also think that the press has to reevaluate how it reports on political parties and conflicts between political parties, because when one of the political parties' prime motivating principle is bad faith and lying and propping up an autocrat, this is not a both sides situation where you say, well, the Republicans wanted this and the Democrats wanted that, and they couldn't come together on a piece of legislation because of partisan gridlock. That is not a useful way to report on what is going on, because it does the public a disservice in terms of being able to understand what the dynamics are at work here. So regardless of whether we have lost Trump loyalists to the truth for the foreseeable future, the press still needs to get past that idea that we just report that there's partisan gridlock because the parties can't agree.
Sarah Ricardi-Swartz, how does this resonate with you as an anthropologist? Sarah Posner has described Trump supporters, a large portion of Trump supporters, as immune to the truth. How do you understand the kinds of Trump supporters who would be moved to violently march on the Capitol from the point of view of an anthropologist?
The task of anthropology is always to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And I think that certainly the events of January 6th and the actions of Trump over the last 4 years and the big lie that he's told his followers are really grotesquely strange to us. And it's my job as an anthropologist to gather that data about that strangeness, whether it's online or it's in person, and to think about it in contextual and intersectional ways that really help us think about the social, the political, the religious, and cultural dimension. So I have to listen carefully. It's my responsibility to listen and try to understand, and not just to assume that they're immune to truth, but that they have a different understanding of the truth. And of course, that's really the difficult part, right? To work with groups that ascribe to far different politics and worldviews and mindsets than our own. And this is why I have said, and I continue to say, that anthropological research on the far right and the alt-right, while it's limited, is dangerous work, but it's immeasurably valuable work. Because in doing that work, we glimpse beyond our social silos. And so now more than ever, I think we actually need that social scientific research in those communities that are unthinkably like ours. Because if we're ever to recover truth, if we're ever to put back the pieces of our fractured democracy, we can only do that if we understand what motivates people and how they view the world and each other and others. And if we don't do that, then how can we not imagine that there's not a new civil war in our future?
This is really interesting. You each have kind of different approaches to how you would go about thinking or understanding truth from the points of views of people who really seem quite deluded to a lot of people. And it seems that one of the big differences in the case of Sarah Posner as a journalist, you're saying you have to expose and you have to put all of this in context that in ways that show what the dynamics are, understood through a democratic frame, as in if it's not a democratic frame, if it's an autocratic one, things are going to look different. Sarah R.S., you're saying that we need to try to understand people. It's not just about exposing, it's about getting inside and understanding. That's a really different approach. Sarah Posner, go ahead.
So I agree. So in many ways, journalism is similar to anthropology from the standpoint that you seek to understand where people are coming from. And as a reporter who's reported a lot on religion, obviously, that's something that I seek to do as well. But we're living through a particular moment where people's brains have been poisoned by their political leaders. And it's very important to understand how those political leaders gained and kept power and gained the ability to poison the brains of their followers with lies. And that is something that is very important for historians and for journalists. And it's very important for understanding this particular moment, because people do not, in this particular case, say somebody who believes in the QAnon conspiracy theory, they did not magically come up with this on their own. And we have to understand the ways in which this has toxified the political environment as well as people's personal lives.
Sarah Ricardi-Swartz, the night before the attack on the Capitol, Don Lemon on CNN featured an interview with Stop the Steal demonstrators who were gathering in DC, and they were interviewed and said, basically they want a civil war. And Don Lemon called them crazy. And you responded saying, calling far-right folks crazy only widens the truth divide. And I'm quoting you, Sarah, I've spent the last 4 years studying far-right ideologies and a year living with a community that held political beliefs far removed from my own. We have to be able to understand the life worlds these folks inhabit if we are to have meaningful dialogue that goes beyond dismissive rhetoric. So what does that look like? How do we do that? And, what do you say to those who might be saying now, I don't want meaningful dialogue with someone in a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt. I don't want meaningful dialogue with someone who bludgeons a Capitol Police officer to death with a flagpole.
Right. Well, it doesn't look like it's easy to create meaningful dialogue, right? I had a friend ask me recently how I could even think of having conversations with violent insurrectionists, or even just folks who have bought into the big lie, the election lie, and were not complicit in the attacks on January 6th. And I replied to him, how could we not think of having these conversations? The last 4 years and the events at the Capitol are symptoms of the larger social fractures that have been historically present in the US, but have been toxified, as Sarah has rightly pointed out. So the polarization in our country isn't new. And this imic othering of others, this siloing of ourselves, is actually quite historical in some ways. And as someone who's worked in Appalachia and who grew up in the Ozarks, I've seen this a lot. And it's people wanting to live in their bubbles and letting the media turn folks into stereotypes while we hide out and we feel good about ourselves for not being them. And that's a problem, because think about the number of people who were mobilized to fight on January 6th for what they believed was a correct election result, the election of Donald Trump. And remember that over 74 million people voted for him. Are we going to ignore them? Are we going to dismiss them? We have to listen to them. And this, I think a lot of this has happened because we weren't listening. We weren't listening and talking. Now, listening and talking to those who have brought these violent acts to our Capitol building is not easy. And it doesn't mean that we're supporting their ideas or that we're condoning them, especially if they're violent. But what it does mean is that we, at the very least, have created a human connection. And that's a powerful thing, because it's much harder to hate someone after you've talked to them and tried to understand their positionality. And as an anthropologist, I can only hope that that goes both ways.
So one of the things we've seen then is that even as people are confronted with evidence that contradicts their beliefs, they don't always change their views. Some disregard the evidence because they distrust the source, or others may reluctantly accept it, but that doesn't change how they feel. And a lot of this comes down to strong feelings. What feels true? How do we deal with that?
I think we have to document it. I mean, that's the thing I go back to, is evidence, right? And it's really hard when you see yourself represented on paper. So one of the difficulties I had when I was in the field is that people couldn't believe that I portrayed them as supporters of Vladimir Putin, American supporters of Vladimir Putin. And one of the things I said back to them in an article I wrote was that these were their own words, and it's really hard to see yourself written down. So documenting that evidence, which is a huge part of recovering the truth, is key for me.
Sarah Posner, you want to add to this?
Again, I come back to, and I think this is a difference in our professions between my profession and Sarah Ricardi-Swartz's profession, because one of the things that to me is most interesting as a journalist, like obviously it's interesting what people think and what they do, quote unquote, regular people, but I'm very interested in political power and how it's wielded. And when you see people in positions of political power, manipulating people into thinking that they've been left behind, or that somebody else's civil rights have meant a diminishment of their own freedom, there's a truth problem there too, right? So when you have political leaders or religious leaders describing civil rights for others in that way. So for example, how a lot of white evangelicals believe that greater civil rights for LGBTQ people has been a diminishment of their religious freedom. So, you can't really separate how they've been told those things from the way they act out their politics in the public square or in their churches. And I guess what I'm saying is you can't make excuses for people by saying, oh, well, they feel like they've been left behind. Why do they feel like they left behind? You have to document what they've been told by their political leaders to stoke their grievances about their fellow citizens.
So our reflection comes as the House has impeached the president for a second time. We've seen the National Guard camped out on the floor of the Capitol. Rioters at the Capitol, meanwhile, had scrawled "murder the media" on its walls. And we're hearing calls for unity and reconciliation. We're hearing them conspicuously from Republicans in Congress. So Sarah Posner, what do you say to calls for unity and reconciliation?
Well, coming from the party that supported the president, who talked incessantly about prosecuting his political enemies, who called for Black protesters at his rallies to be roughed up, who separated children from their parents, for the party that talked about liberals being delicate snowflakes and all of that kind of rhetoric. It's a little rich for now, after Trump incited a mob to storm the Capitol, for them to demand that Democrats reconcile with them. So yes, I do think that the country should be united, but it should be united around a recognition by the Republican Party, by the elected officials in the Republican Party, of what their support for Trump has meant for the country and has meant for individuals in this country who have been harmed, and in some cases, lethally so, by Trump's policies and his actions and inactions.
I think I would just say that we need to take a good long reflexive look at the feelings and power structures in our country that have allowed January 6th to take place. The affordances provided to white evangelicals, especially white evangelical males, that allowed much of this to take place. We need to look at what's going on and take seriously the problem of Christian nationalism in the United States, because that's what Sarah's talking about with those power structures. Unless we understand fully Christian nationalism and its relationship to the far right and the alt-right, I don't think we'll ever be able to understand or recover truth.
That was Sarah Ricardi-Swartz and Sarah Posner joining us for our conversation today. Thank you for being part of it.
Thank you, John and Tracy.
Thanks, everyone.
So let's talk a little bit about some specific steps that we can take to bridge the truth divide.
We would most love to see the big lie called out for what it is, especially by Republicans. With former Trump Department of Homeland Security official Elizabeth Newman, we believe that the most effective response to the growing threat would be, quote, for the bulk of Republicans to come out and say, the election was not stolen, Donald Trump lied, I was complicit in that lie, and I apologize, end quote. That's unlikely to happen. So we commend the 10 Republican representatives who broke ranks with their party and voted with Democrats on January 13th to impeach Donald Trump for incitement of insurrection. This group includes Washington Representative Jamie Herrera Butler, who explained her vote by saying, quote, I'm not choosing a side, I'm choosing truth.
So one upside we've seen to the truth divide is that it's created a really diverse and nonpartisan consensus of Americans who have shown that they really do value truth and democracy, and they prefer that over fascism and the big lie. We can disagree on lots of other things while still holding some basic civic truths. As well, companies, universities, foundations, campaign donors, and citizens are cutting ties with those in government or putting pressure on them, those who further these dangerous lies about the election. And this gives truth some power, puts liars on notice.
And we've also seen, particularly here in Arizona, principled conservatives, centrists, and progressives coming together, breaking out of the old culture wars paradigm and working to elect Joe Biden. And we've also seen people who supported Trump, but have been unwilling to lie and place their loyalty to him over their oath to the Constitution and defense of democracy.
That's really a strong coalition for truth, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But of course, we've still got a lot of work to do across many sectors of society as we recognize the precarious nature of truth in our democracy.
We'll be back soon to talk about recovering truth in our political life. I'm Tracy Fessenden.
And I'm John Carlson. This podcast is part of the Recovering Truth Project at Arizona State University's Center for the Study of Religion and Conflict, in partnership with the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication, and supported by a generous grant from the Henry Luce Foundation.
Our producer is Sarah Ventre, and our team includes Matt Correa, Sarah Ricardi-Swartz, and Sarah Lords. Our music is by Ketsa.
Thank you for recovering truth with us.